When the plane doors closed and the passengers settled into their seats, the cabin was filled with the usual hum of whispered conversations, rustling bags, and the faint chime of the safety announcements. The black executive, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of quiet confidence and success, eased into his assigned seat. It wasn't just any seat, it was a premium one, the kind reserved for those who had earned their place through hard work, loyalty, or sheer determination. For him, it symbolized more than comfort on a long journey. It was a reminder of the years he had invested in himself, the sacrifices made, the countless hours spent proving his worth in rooms where people doubted him before he even spoke. He placed his briefcase carefully by his side, straightened his jacket, and prepared himself for the trip ahead, unaware that this ordinary flight was about to turn into an extraordinary test of character. It began with a look. A flight attendant approached, her eyes scanning the row, her brows furrowing slightly as though something seemed out of place. She paused in front of him, and with a polite yet uneasy smile, asked to see his boarding pass again. He obliged, handing it over without hesitation, even though he knew exactly what it said. She glanced at it, her expression tightening before handing it back. Her voice was smooth, practiced, but carried an undertone that did not escape him. "Sir, this seat may have been assigned incorrectly. Could you wait a moment while we sort this out?" Around them, passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others openly watching with curiosity. What should have been a simple acknowledgement of his rightful place became the first ripple in a growing wave of discomfort. Another attendant soon appeared, followed by murmurs among the nearby passengers. The executive sat quietly, observing, his posture steady, his face calm, but his mind sharpened by the sting of familiarity. This wasn't the first time his presence had been questioned in a space where people didn't expect to see him. Success, status, and credentials had never fully shielded him from assumptions rooted not in fact but in the color of his skin. Each repetition of such moments carved a deeper mark, and yet he had trained himself to meet them with composure. The situation escalated when a white passenger arrived, ticket in hand, and the attendants immediately turned toward him with a welcoming tone. The comparison was stark. The passenger's seat assignment matched the very one the executive occupied, but instead of investigating further or considering alternative explanations, the attendants turned back to him with an almost rehearsed firmness. They explained that he needed to move, that perhaps there had been a mix-up, that the other gentleman was entitled to the seat. The air grew heavy. A few passengers whispered audibly now, their eyes darting back and forth between the two men as though watching a scene play out on a stage. For the executive, the moment stretched. It wasn't simply about a seat anymore. It was about the indignity of being treated as though his presence was a mistake, as though he had slipped into a world that wasn't meant for him. The shock of public disrespect wasn't just in the words spoken to him but in the way they were spoken, in the disbelief that he belonged there, in the ease with which he was expected to surrender. Every detail, the narrowing eyes, the shift in tone, the assumption that the other man's claim was more credible, spoke louder than the words themselves. He looked at the faces around him. Some showed discomfort, their eyes flickering with silent recognition of the unfairness unfolding. Others seemed indifferent, detached, as though such moments were trivial or none of their concern. A few wore subtle smirks, quietly affirming their belief in the attendants' assumptions. The cabin had become a mirror reflecting society's layers of bias, judgment, and complicity. And in the center of it all sat a man who had already fought these battles in boardrooms, in negotiations, in countless subtle encounters that tried to diminish his worth. The shock of disrespect was amplified by its setting. On a plane, space is shared but confined. There is nowhere to retreat, nowhere to quietly excuse oneself without surrendering completely. Every interaction is magnified, every exchange observed. In that pressurized environment, what should have been a routine flight transformed into a public test of whether dignity could withstand humiliation. The executive knew what was happening wasn't just about him, it was about what everyone else in that cabin was being made to witness. It was a moment where truth revealed itself not in grand speeches or declarations but in the small cruelties of everyday interactions. The silence that followed the attendant's words was heavier than the engine's roar outside the cabin. Passengers who had been chatting moments earlier now hushed, their eyes drifting toward the confrontation unfolding in the premium section. Silence is often louder than noise, and in that instant, it screamed judgment. The black executive could feel it, dozens of pairs of eyes, some burning with curiosity, others filled with unspoken opinions. People who had no part in the exchange suddenly became silent jurors, each forming conclusions without saying a word. The weight of their gazes pressed against him, not because he feared them, but because he recognized the familiar pattern of silent judgment that so often shapes the outcome of moments like this. A man across the aisle leaned back in his seat, arms folded, his lips pursed in a thin line that carried both disapproval and satisfaction. To him, the scene seemed to confirm his unspoken belief about who belonged in those seats and who did not. A woman a few rows behind shifted uncomfortably, her brow furrowed as though she wanted to say something but lacked the courage. Another passenger glanced down at their phone, pretending not to notice, yet the tightness in their shoulders betrayed the tension they were absorbing. Silence wasn't neutrality, it was complicity, each unspoken word adding to the atmosphere that suggested the executive was an intruder in a space he had rightfully earned. In that silence, assumptions multiplied. Some passengers likely wondered whether he had truly purchased the seat, whether perhaps the staff had made a clerical error, whether maybe, just maybe, he had slipped into a place not meant for him. The presence of the white passenger standing nearby with his boarding pass only fueled those assumptions. The ease with which the attendants addressed him, the way their tones softened when speaking to him, created an invisible hierarchy in the cabin. The unspoken message was clear, one man was trusted, the other doubted, and the jury of passengers watched it all unfold without intervention. The executive sat still, his posture erect, his gaze steady. He was no stranger to the weight of eyes, no stranger to being measured not by his credentials but by perceptions beyond his control. Yet there was something particularly piercing about this moment. Here, inside a cabin suspended thousands of feet above the ground, he was trapped not only physically but also socially. Every breath he took, every movement he made was being interpreted, scrutinized, judged. He wasn't just a man defending his seat, he had become, unwillingly, a symbol of something larger, an embodiment of every stereotype, every bias, every assumption that hovered silently in the room. What made the judgment so cutting wasn't that people spoke against him, but that they didn't. No one stepped in to ask the attendants to double-check before removing him. No one insisted on fairness or suggested that perhaps the mix-up wasn't his fault. The silence suggested that many accepted the narrative unfolding before them. They didn't need proof, their stares revealed that the possibility of his guilt was more believable than the certainty of his innocence. That kind of silence carried the sting of betrayal, the quiet erosion of dignity that comes not with loud insults but with whispered agreement and passive compliance. The air inside the cabin grew tense, and the silence began to echo in his mind. He could feel the unspoken conversations taking place in the passengers' heads. Some were calculating whether they should intervene, others deciding it wasn't their business, while a few reveled quietly in the spectacle of someone being put in their place. The collective gaze of the crowd carried the same sharpness as words spoken aloud, a reminder that sometimes silence wounds more than sound. And yet, within that silence lay something else too, something subtle but undeniable. A few eyes among the many seemed to carry empathy, hesitation, even shame. A man sitting diagonally ahead leaned slightly forward, his expression conflicted, as though fighting with himself over whether to speak up. A woman clutched her armrest tightly, her face tense with discomfort, her silence not born of agreement but of fear. These flickers of humanity, though faint, revealed that not every heart in the cabin was hardened. Some recognized the wrongness of the moment but lacked the courage to challenge it. The silence of the majority still drowned out the compassion of the few, but the presence of those quiet allies added a layer of complexity to the atmosphere. The executive absorbed it all without a word, his silence speaking just as loudly as theirs. He understood the weight of perception and knew the danger of reacting rashly under so many eyes. He had been here before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in social settings where his presence was questioned. Each time, the silent judgment of others shaped the air around him, tilting the scales before he even opened his mouth. This was no different. The passenger's silence wasn't passive, it was active participation in a narrative being written before their eyes. And for him, the pain of the moment wasn't in the attendant's demand alone but in the unspoken verdict rendered by the crowd. The moment stretched as the executive weighed the tension in the air. The attendant stood expectantly, the white passenger shifted with an air of entitlement, and the silent crowd continued to watch as if the cabin itself were a courtroom. He understood the stakes. Any outburst, any flash of anger, any raised voice would be seized upon as proof that he was out of place, that he was aggressive, that he did not belong in the seat he had rightfully earned. He also knew that remaining silent would allow the disrespect to harden into truth in the minds of those watching. Between the two choices, he chose a third path, a calm yet powerful response that demanded attention not through volume but through dignity. He leaned back slightly in his seat, his body relaxed though the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon him. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his boarding pass, holding it up without urgency, his hand steady. His voice, when it came, was measured and unshaken. "This is my seat," he said, each word deliberate, firm without hostility. He did not raise his tone, but the clarity of his speech carried through the cabin. For a brief second, the silence was interrupted, and every passenger seemed to lean inward, listening not just to what he said but to how he said it. The attendants hesitated, their certainty shaken by the composure in his demeanor. He placed the boarding pass on the tray table in front of him, tapping it gently once as though to anchor the truth of his presence. Then, without arrogance, he introduced himself. Not with a flourish, not with boastfulness, but with the calm authority of a man who had nothing to prove yet everything to affirm. He stated his name, his role as an executive, and the company he represented. The titles were not spoken as shields of superiority but as reminders that his place in that seat was no accident, no mistake, no charity. They were the product of decades of dedication, sacrifice, and perseverance that no moment of prejudice could erase. The cabin shifted subtly. Murmurs spread among the passengers as his words dismantled the assumptions that had been hanging in the air. The calmness with which he spoke forced those who had silently judged him to confront their own bias. He was not begging to stay, nor was he demanding with anger. He was simply affirming the truth, and in doing so, he shifted the balance of power in the room. His calm response became louder than any protest could have been. The white passenger, who had moments earlier carried himself with entitlement, now looked uneasy. The attendants, caught between procedure and perception, glanced at one another, their professional masks faltering. They had expected compliance, perhaps even confrontation, but not this unshakable composure that revealed more strength than defiance ever could. His presence in that moment was undeniable, not because of his title or his suit, but because of the way he carried himself under scrutiny. He continued, his words now touching not just the attendants but the watching crowd. He spoke about dignity, about respect, about how assumptions had too often shaped encounters like this one. He did not accuse, he did not attack, but his words cut sharper than any condemnation. By holding a mirror to the situation, he forced everyone present to see it clearly. And in that clarity, the injustice could no longer be brushed aside as a simple misunderstanding. His calm response reframed the moment from a dispute over a seat to a lesson about perception, bias, and resilience. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing the weight of their silence. Others looked at him with newfound respect, their earlier assumptions dissolving in the light of his steady truth. A young man seated near the back leaned forward as if absorbing every word, his eyes wide with admiration. The cabin was no longer just a space for travel, it had become a stage for something far greater, a demonstration of how composure can dismantle discrimination. The attendants finally softened, their earlier firmness crumbling under the power of his presence. They took the boarding pass once more, checked it against their records, and realized what he had known all along, he was in the right seat. But the victory was not in proving the paperwork, it was in the way he had responded. By refusing to yield his dignity, by answering disrespect with calm strength, he transformed a humiliating encounter into a moment of undeniable authority. The atmosphere in the cabin was different now. The silence that had once carried judgment was replaced with silence of another kind, one filled with reflection, discomfort, and even admiration. Where there had been whispers of doubt, there now lingered an unspoken acknowledgement of his power, not the power of his title but the power of his character. Dignity, when wielded with calm certainty, has the power to dismantle even the strongest walls of prejudice. The executive's response did not come in the form of anger or loud confrontation, yet it carried a force that rippled through the entire cabin. He had chosen restraint over rage, clarity over chaos, and in doing so, he showed that dignity was not weakness but strength in its purest form. The attendants, who had initially approached him with suspicion and firmness, now stood disarmed. Their authority, which had seemed unquestionable minutes before, suddenly appeared fragile under the weight of his composed defiance. The cabin, once buzzing with silent judgment, shifted into a place of reflection. Passengers who had been comfortable in their indifference now found themselves confronted by the undeniable truth that dignity, when preserved, holds a mirror up to injustice. They saw a man who could have lashed out, who could have matched disrespect with hostility, but who instead chose to sit tall, to speak with steady resolve, and to remind everyone watching that dignity is unshakable when rooted in self-worth. His refusal to surrender his composure revealed the flaws in the assumptions that had been placed upon him, and in that revelation, the discrimination began to unravel. The attendants, fumbling for words, attempted to soften their approach, framing the situation as a misunderstanding. But the passengers had witnessed too much for that explanation to erase what had occurred. They had seen the difference in tone when the white passenger had been addressed, they had heard the insistence that the executive was in the wrong, and they had felt the tension that filled the air before he spoke. Now, those memories contrasted sharply against the executive's calm assertion of truth. The lie of bias could not withstand the dignity of his response, and the more he sat firm, the more the narrative tilted in his favor. What made his dignity so powerful was that it exposed the imbalance without him ever having to name it. By refusing to react in the way prejudice expects, through anger, frustration, or surrender, he denied the attendants and the doubting passengers the validation of their assumptions. They had expected resistance, perhaps even an outburst that would justify their initial treatment of him. Instead, they were faced with a man who carried himself with more grace than the situation deserved, a man who turned their disrespect into a spotlight shining back on them. His dignity dismantled the discrimination by showing how baseless it was, how flimsy it looked when pressed against the reality of his calm truth. The passengers began to see themselves in the reflection of his composure. Those who had been silent felt the sting of their inaction more acutely, realizing that his dignity magnified their lack of courage. Those who had judged him harshly without cause now found themselves shrinking under the quiet weight of their error. And those who had doubted whether he belonged in that seat could no longer deny that he carried himself with more authority than anyone else in the cabin. Dignity, in that moment, became a force stronger than confrontation, it became a lesson that no one in that plane would easily forget. The executive's calmness did not erase the pain of the disrespect, but it transformed it. Instead of letting the incident define him as a victim of prejudice, he used his composure to redefine the moment as one of power. Each word he spoke, each gesture he made, was measured not to win favor but to uphold truth. He had not sought to embarrass the attendants, yet their own actions became embarrassing in contrast to his poise. He had not aimed to shame the passengers, yet many felt shame rise within them as they realized how quickly they had accepted a false narrative. His dignity forced everyone to confront their own roles in sustaining or dismantling discrimination. As the attendants finally conceded and acknowledged that the seat was his, the executive did not gloat or relish in their discomfort. His expression remained steady, his posture unchanged, as though to show that he had expected nothing less than the truth to prevail. That restraint was perhaps the most powerful element of all, for it proved that dignity is not a weapon of arrogance but a shield of self-respect. It dismantles discrimination not by crushing the opponent but by stripping away the falsehoods that give it power. The cabin, once tense with division, now felt different. The passengers, whether they admitted it or not, had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen how a man could hold his ground without raising his voice, how dignity could silence prejudice more effectively than confrontation ever could. They had been part of a moment where discrimination was exposed, not through accusation, but through the undeniable presence of calm truth. And though no one said it aloud, the lesson lingered in the air, imprinted in the minds of everyone who had watched it unfold. The air in the cabin no longer felt the same. Where moments earlier there had been sharp edges of tension and silent judgment, there was now a subtle but undeniable shift. The atmosphere carried with it a sense of unease, as though the passengers were collectively wrestling with the weight of what they had just witnessed. The executive's calm yet powerful response had unsettled the balance of the room, turning what could have been dismissed as a simple seating dispute into a moment that revealed something far deeper. The attendants, once firm and confident, now moved with hesitation, their steps slower, their voices softer, as if they had suddenly realized the fragility of the authority they carried. Passengers who had avoided eye contact earlier now found themselves stealing glances at the executive, their expressions different than before. Respect had replaced suspicion in some, shame had replaced indifference in others. The silence that filled the cabin was no longer heavy with judgment but with reflection. It was as though everyone present had been forced into a pause, a reckoning with the quiet truth that had been laid bare before them. The shift was subtle, yet it was powerful enough to change the energy in the air. The white passenger who had arrived expecting the seat shifted uncomfortably in his place, his earlier confidence now eroded by the way events had unfolded. His entitlement had been stripped away, not by confrontation, but by the undeniable composure of the man who refused to be moved. He avoided looking directly at the executive, his gaze darting elsewhere, as though searching for a way to escape the spotlight that had inadvertently fallen upon him. The quiet discomfort he radiated only deepened the sense that something had fundamentally changed in the cabin. The attendants, eager to move forward, attempted to carry on with their duties, but the shift in atmosphere lingered. Every time they passed the executive's row, there was a subtle change in their body language, a stiffness in their gestures, an awareness that their earlier actions could not be undone. The passengers, too, were altered. Conversations that resumed did so in hushed tones, cautious, as though the normal rhythm of chatter felt out of place after what had transpired. It was as if everyone understood that the flight had become more than a journey from one destination to another, it had become a lesson, and no one could quite return to how things had been before. What made the shift so powerful was not just the outcome, but the way it had been achieved. The executive had shown that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it arrives in the form of calm certainty, in the refusal to bow to injustice, in the quiet insistence on one's rightful place. That kind of strength leaves an impression that lingers long after the moment has passed, and the passengers could feel it. Each of them carried their own interpretation, but none could deny that they had witnessed dignity dismantle disrespect in a way that exposed their own roles, whether as silent observers, quiet judges, or passive participants. The executive himself sat unchanged in appearance, his posture still composed, his expression still steady. But around him, the space had transformed. The very air seemed to acknowledge him differently now, as though the cabin itself recognized the shift in power. Where once there had been doubt and dismissal, there was now an unspoken recognition of authority. The passengers, whether they admired him openly or not, could no longer see him as anything less than someone who belonged exactly where he was. Some passengers who had initially looked on with quiet skepticism now carried expressions of regret. They shifted in their seats, glancing toward him and then away, perhaps replaying their earlier thoughts in their minds. Others looked at him with something closer to admiration, their silence no longer passive but filled with respect. The shift in atmosphere was not only external but internal, reshaping the way each person saw themselves in the context of what had just unfolded. Even those who wished to dismiss the incident could not escape its weight. The image of a man standing firm in his dignity, refusing to be diminished, lingered in their minds. It unsettled the comfortable assumptions they may have carried, challenged the easy narratives they may have believed, and left them with questions they could not easily silence. The flight continued as before, the hum of the engine steady, the attendants moving through their routines, but beneath it all lay a quiet current of reflection that could not be ignored. The unexpected shift in the atmosphere was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and deeply felt. It transformed the cabin from a place of silent complicity into a place of silent recognition. No words needed to be spoken for everyone to know that something significant had occurred. It was written in the way people avoided each other's eyes, in the way conversation stumbled before regaining rhythm, in the way the attendants' voices carried an edge of caution. The change had settled into the air, unseen yet undeniable, and everyone was aware of it. When the tension in the cabin finally gave way to silence, what remained was not just the memory of an uncomfortable incident but the imprint of a powerful lesson. Every passenger who had witnessed the moment carried with them something that could not easily be shaken off. It was not simply about a seating dispute or a mistake in protocol, it had become a demonstration of how dignity, when defended with composure, could rise above prejudice and leave an impact far beyond the walls of the airplane. The executive had not raised his voice, had not allowed anger to control him, and yet his presence spoke louder than anything else in the cabin. His response became a reminder that strength does not always come from confrontation but often from the quiet courage to hold one's ground with unshakable grace. The lasting lesson each person walked away with was different, shaped by their role in the unfolding of events. For the attendants, it was a confrontation with the reality of their own bias. Their authority had been unquestioned until the executive's calm assertion revealed how easily it could be used to uphold assumptions rather than truth. They had approached him with doubt, expecting compliance, and in doing so, had revealed the thin line between professional procedure and discriminatory instinct. Their lesson was one of accountability, of understanding that the way they chose to treat passengers did not happen in a vacuum but carried consequences for dignity, respect, and justice. For the white passenger who had expected the seat, the lesson carried another weight. His entitlement, unspoken but visible in his demeanor, had been disrupted not by anger but by dignity. He had been forced to see himself through the mirror of the executive's composure, and in that reflection, the fragility of his assumptions became clear. The seat he thought would be his by default was never truly his to begin with. His discomfort lingered, not because he had lost a place to sit, but because he had been exposed to the reality that privilege could be challenged without a single raised voice. The passengers who sat quietly, watching without intervening, carried yet another lesson. Many of them had been silent jurors, some passing judgment, others retreating into indifference, and a few sympathizing quietly but unwilling to speak. Their silence had been a shield, protecting them from involvement, but it also revealed their complicity. When the executive refused to bend, his calm resistance forced them to reckon with their own choices. They realized that silence does not absolve responsibility, it becomes part of the story. For some, the lesson was uncomfortable, a reminder that neutrality in the face of injustice often serves to uphold it. For others, it was inspiring, a call to be braver the next time they witnessed such treatment. For the executive himself, the lesson was not new but it was reaffirming. He had long known that success and achievement did not always protect him from prejudice, that his presence in certain spaces would always be questioned by some. But this moment reinforced that dignity, when held firmly, has the power to redefine the narrative. He had transformed what could have been a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of strength. His lesson was one of confirmation, that the path he had walked, marked by resilience and composure, was not only for himself but also for those who watched him, those who needed to see that it was possible to stand tall in the face of disrespect. The most profound impact of all was on those who would carry the story with them beyond the flight. A young man seated a few rows back, who had watched every moment with wide eyes, now had an example etched in his memory of how strength could look different from what the world often portrayed. A woman who had felt ashamed of her silence resolved quietly that she would not remain quiet again if faced with such a moment. Even those who had smirked or doubted at first now found themselves uneasy, carrying the weight of having been wrong. The lesson was not just about one man defending his seat, it was about how truth, when spoken with dignity, has the power to ripple outward, touching even those who least expect it. Long after the attendants resumed their duties and the hum of the plane settled back into its rhythm, the moment lingered. It was in the way passengers glanced at the executive with newfound respect, in the way they avoided each other's eyes as though acknowledging silently that they had been part of something larger than a routine flight. The lesson became part of the atmosphere, a quiet reminder that dignity is not fragile but unbreakable when grounded in self-respect. It showed that one person's response to disrespect can create a shift that no one forgets, a shift that lingers long after the plane lands and the passengers go their separate ways.